Hello, sixth graders. I'm going to go through chapter 11 with you just to kind of review what you read yesterday. One of the main things that you were reading about yesterday was the difference between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians, of course, were the wealthier, aristocratic group, and the plebeians were more of the just common people. So the patricians were members of the aristocracy. They were very powerful, wealthy. They would have had large private homes, hired tutors to teach their children. Their clothing would have been more colorful. It would have had distinguishing markings on it to show that they were aristocrats. The plebeians, on the other hand, were very common people. They, in the beginning, didn't have very many rights. They would have lived in crowded neighborhoods, in buildings without plumbing. They would have taught children themselves because they wouldn't have been able to afford to hire tutors like the patricians did. They would have most likely held the same job that their parents had held. And their clothing would also show their rank. It would be less colorful and had no distinguishing markings whatsoever. Eventually, they were able to gain some power, and they elected their own leaders, which they called tribunes. There are some similarities between both of these groups. They both spoke Latin. They both worshipped many gods. And in both groups, the women did not participate in the government. Their clothing would have been similar in style. It was just different in the colors and how it was decorated. The government at this time was what was considered a republic, or an aristocratic republic. So the king, which they would have had in more of a monarchy, was replaced by two elected officials, and those were called consuls. The consuls would have been elected by the Senate. The Senate would have been made up of a wealthy group of citizens, especially originally before the plebeians got any control. So they weren't a monarchy, they weren't ruled by a king, but they also weren't a democracy. Instead, they were ruled by consuls and senators. So that's why oftentimes it's called an aristocratic republic, because they were governed by mostly the wealthy leaders, and they were doing some electing of their leaders, but it wasn't a true democracy. The plebeians elected their own leaders, which they called tribunes. And in the beginning, those were completely separate from the patrician government, but later the plebeians did get some control and were participating in the government along with the patricians. The Roman Empire grew fairly rapidly. They started by conquering central Italy and then northern Italy, and so by this time of 275 BCE, the Romans controlled all of Italy. And then within another 100 years, Rome had conquered nearly all the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. So all of that we now see as being parts of Spain and Africa, anything surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, became part of the Roman Empire. They had a very strong army, and the soldiers were able to get many benefits. They were able to bring home things of value that they took from any conquered lands, so that was one way that they could earn money. They also were given land. The conquered territories, so when the armies would go and they would conquer an area, they would organize that area into what they called a province. The province was a territory that was then under Roman control. The conquered people, rather than just being taken prisoner or something like that, actually became part of the Roman Republic and would serve in the army. They were also oftentimes allowed citizenship. And so if those conquered people were made citizens of the Roman Empire, then they were able to also participate in government. So being taken over by the Romans wasn't always a terrible thing. They became part of the Republic and became citizens of Rome, could participate in government. So there were some positives. Rome built a very successful and rich army. The problem was that army became so rich and powerful that it could eventually be used against the Senate and the government.